Welcome to Gemara Markings. Today's Shiur is Yuma Daf Ayin Aleph. Before we begin our Shiur, we should mention that we will be starting from the bottom of Daf Ayin Omid Beis, 3 lines from the bottom, the last one on the line. It's also recommended to have access to a Chumash for today's Shiur. We'll be referring to psukim, to quite a few, as a matter of fact, as we go along. Before also the actual text is concerned, we're going to look at the side of our Gemara, our noseh, our topic heading that you find on the side of Daf Ayin Omid Beis, toward the end of the page, the end of the Gemara page, where we've written, Kol Parshas Avodas B'Yom Kippur, Ksuvo Al HaSeder, Ad Shemagiyim Lohitzas Kafu Machta. When you open the Chumash in Parshas Achrei Mos, Vayikra Perek Tezayin, the Yom Kippur service in the Beis HaMikdash is featured. A number of activities took place, and they're presented in their order until you get to Posuk Chof Gimel. So that at the immediately preceding psukim, you see the activity that was done of a specific Yom Kippur nature, and it was done in the Kohen Gadol's white clothing after he had done the morning daily sacrifice, the Tomid Shel Shachar, and whatever accompanied it. We are not going to get into detail here. This was actually the subject of a previous shiur, but that was done in the standard year-round 8 garments of the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol, as you all know from having learned Yuma, was basically the sole worker when it came to the Yom Kippur activities. So after the daily, the Tomid Shel Shachar was offered while wearing the standard 8 clothing, sometimes called the Big Day Zov, the golden clothing, he then switched into his special Yom Kippur garb for white linen clothing, and that is what you see featured in the psukim leading up to our point, the point with which we will be opening today's Gemara Shiur. So he was wearing those clothing, and we know that in the course of Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would immerse himself 5 times, an immersion at each change of clothing. So there was a morning immersion, which then involved his putting on the golden clothing, and then a second immersion in a mikveh, whereby he put on his white clothing for the special Yom Kippur roll, which involved, amongst other things, the offering of the incense and the sprinkling of the blood of the par and slur of Yom Kippur in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And then after that, there was a change back into golden clothing, the standard clothing, which was preceded, of course, by a 3rd mikveh immersion. And after that, there was a change back into the white clothing, actually different white clothing, but they were white clothing. That would have been the 4th tevilah. And then to end off the day, again, a 5th tevilah, a 5th immersion, where he would put back his golden clothing. This sugya is at the stage where he is in the white clothing, and as we look at the psukim, even without actually reading all of the psukim inside, but we just mentioned that he was dealing with the with the Yom Kippur activities, including the confession made on the Soyer HaChai, the Soyer HaMishtalech, Soyer LaZozel, and that's what we see when we are reading the psukim leading up to Pasuk Chof Gimel. The Soyer HaChai is the subject of the confession, and it is sent away to the desert with the appointed individual known as the Ish Iti, carrying with it the sins of Israel. Now, when this is taking place, the Kohen Gadol is wearing his white clothing. the next pasuk, pasuk Chav Gimel, which is the pasuk that this Gemara opens up with. Pasuk Chav Gimel reads, and again we had recommended having a Chumash, Vayikra Perek Tes Zayin, pasuk Chav Gimel, Uvo Aaron el Ohel Moed, and the Kohen Gadol, which is Aaron, enters the Ohel Moed. And then it says, Uposhad es bigdei habora shir lovash bevoel hakodesh v'nicham sham. He then takes off the white clothing that he had worn upon his entrance to the Kodesh. Now this is a very vague pasuk. It says, he enters the Ohel Moed, and then he takes off the clothing. Now, obviously, he's not taking off his white clothing in the Ohel Moed. So, what did he enter the Ohel Moed for? and it says, and after he entered the Ohel Moed, it says, and then he took off the white clothing that he had been wearing. Well, if you look at the pasuk if you look at the flow of the psukim in their simplest form, well, of course he was wearing his white clothing. So why does the pasuk have to say that he removes the white clothing that he had been wearing? Of course he was wearing them. That's obvious. So if we insert additional information that is not reflected by the order of the psukim, then the whole picture changes. That is going to be the subject of our Gemara. And in fact, maybe before we read the actual text, sometimes it's good to familiarize yourself with what will be coming up before we do it in the actual text. So our hope, once again, is, forgive me if I'm sounding repetitive, but you should have a Chumash in front of you. And in Pasuk Chav Daled, the Torah tells us he immerses himself and he puts on his clothing. V'rochas es besor b'mayim b'mokum kodesh v'lovash es begodov. V'yotza v'yosa es oiloso v'es oilos ha'am v'chiper ba'adoi uv'ad beiso. We spoke extensively in our previous Shiur about the various korbanos that are offered on Yom Kippur. Here we have a reference to two ram offerings, a personal ram offering, and the El Ha'am, a ram of the nation, which is a korban oila. If you take the information in Pasuk Chav Daled and place it right after Pasuk Chav Beis, then what we will be witnessing is he had been wearing, as we said, his white clothing for the internal Yom Kippur activities and the confession over the scapegoat, the Soyer Lazozel, and that was in Pasuk Chav Beis. In Pasuk Chav Daled, we would then imagine that after having worn the white clothing for the Yom Kippur services, he changes into the golden clothing, and of course he immerses in the mikveh, which we said is necessary between changes of clothing, and that's what you see in Pasuk Chav Daled, immersion in the mikveh. And then V'lovash es begodov, he then puts on his golden clothing and goes to offer the oilosov, as the pasuk says, v'yotzav v'yotzav oilosov oilosam v'chiber ba'ado v'adom. He then goes and processes these korban olos, which are external courtyard-based activities. They're done in the azora and not in the heichal, which would have demanded white clothing, but no, it's done in the azora, for which the golden clothing are quite appropriate. And then after doing that, he would go back into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which is what is featured in Pasuk Chav Gimel. Of course, another immersion is required, a fourth immersion is required. Entering the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that's what the pasuk says in Pasuk Chav Gimel, Vo Aaron el Ohel Moed. He enters the Ohel Moed for the purpose of removing the kaf and machta, the vessels, the pans that had been used in the incense during the earlier part of the service. The pans he had left in there until this point. So he's going back into the Oil Moyed, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, removing the pants, and for this he is wearing the white clothing. And he then exits, again necessitating a change back into the golden clothing for the fifth immersion of the day, and doing what needs to be done after that. That's the general scheme of the Gemara we will be dealing with. The Gemara will ask, why was it necessary for us to change the order of the psukim if the whole goal is to have something between that which is taught in Pasuk Chav Beis and that which is taught in Pasuk Chav Gimel? Could we not have imported some other external activity and put it in that spot, leaving the sequence of psukim in Perek Tez Zayin as they are, just inserting something external, and we would have been able to accomplish a change into golden clothing between Pasuk Chav Beis and Pasuk Chav Gimel, and then continue with Pasuk Chav Gimel changing back into the white clothing, and then continuing onwards Pasuk Chav Daled changing back into the golden clothing, essentially preserving what we want to do, the basic model, without changing the order of these specific psukim. So that will be something the Gemara itself will deal with. But having spoken this out ahead of time, our hope is that it'll be a little bit easier as we go into the Gemara. So with all of that introduction aside, let us now turn to the Gemara itself. Daf Hayomi Beis, toward the bottom, 3 lines from the bottom. Kidesh Yodov V'Raglov. Tonu Rabbanan. Uvo Aaron El Oyel Moyed. The Pasuk says, Pasuk Gimel, and he enters the Oyel Moyed, the enclosed part of the Beis HaMikdash. Lama Hubo. What is he going in there for? As we saw already by learning the psukim with the open chumash, we saw that it didn't reveal what was happening. It just says he went in. Well, what did he go in for? Answer: Lahoitzi es hakaf v'es hamachta. He went in to remove these two vessels, the kaf and machta. They were used for holding the incense and the coals that were brought in there earlier for the incense offering in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So he's now going back into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to remove the kaf and machta. We continue at the top of Ayin Aleph. Shekol HaParsha Kula Nemro Al HaSeder. All of the psukim from the beginning of Perek Tez Zayin reflect the order of activities during Yom Kippur in the Beis HaMikdash, chutz mi Pasuk Zeh, with the exception of this Pasuk, Pasuk Chav Gimel, which is not in its actual location as far as order of events are concerned. My time off. Why is this? Before we continue in the Gemara, we have a marking, a crown shape, and on the side, under our mivneh, or structural note, we note that these crowns. You have one here, and a few lines later around Rava. Hezberim lama hadichtiv. Once again, Hezberim lama hadichtiv pasuk chav dalid hikdim lama shebet pasuk chav gimel. We're going to explain why the events in pasuk chav dalid, which involve the processing of the Eilo, the El Ha'am, the ram offerings, why they necessarily took place before that which is taught in Pasuk Chav Gimel. So as we said, Rav Chisda addresses this, and later Rava will address this. Omar Rav Chisda. And the answer here takes a number of lines. Let's take note of that. It's a long answer. Rav Chisda tells us, Gemiri, we have an oral tradition. Chomesh Tvilos v'asora Kiddushin Toivel Kohen Gadol u'Mekadesh Bo Bayom. The oral tradition states that there are 5 instances of immersion in the mikveh on the part of the Kohen Gadol, and 10 hand-feet washings that are called Kiddush Yadayim B'Raglayim, that he does in the course of the day. Ve'i amris kesidron ksivi, if you leave the psukim as they are, namely, you would be just leading in from Pasuk Chav Gimel, from Pasuk Chav Beis into Pasuk Chav Gimel. So what you will have noticed is that leading up till that point, he had done an early morning immersion before working in the Beis Hamikdash. Then after the Tomit Shel Shachar, he did a second immersion into the white clothing for the Yom Kippur services. And if we keep the order straight as it is, so Pasuk Chav Gimel, Pasuk Chav Beis, he was in those white clothing following that second immersion. Pasuk Chav, we said again, Chav Beis, Chav Gimel. And then when you get to Chav Daled, that will be the third immersion where he changes into the golden clothing for the Elo and El Ha'am. So if you leave the psukim as they are, Lo mishkachas lo elo sholosh tevilos v'shisha kiddushim. You won't find more than a total of 3 immersions, as we just described, and 6 kiddushin, when we know that there were 5 immersions, not 3, 5 and 10 kiddushin. So what have we accomplished by telling you that after Chof Beis, which represented activities following the second mikveh, the second tevilah, then imagine there is Pasuk Chav Daled. And when I say imagine, it means imagine the reordering of the psukim, but in actuality, it's not a function of imagination, but rather after Chof Beis, he then did the Elo Ve'elam, necessitating a third immersion. After Elo Ve'elam, back into white clothing, that's a 4th immersion for going in to take out the Kafel Machta. And after taking out the Kafel Machta, back into golden clothing, demanding a 5th immersion. As we said, between changes of clothing, there are immersions. So that would solve the problem. So Rav Chisda is saying, as a result of the Halacha L'Moshe Misina, this oral tradition, that there are 5 tefillos and 10 kiddushin, that forces us to understand the events in Pasuk Chav Daled taking place prior to the event in Pasuk Chav Gimel. That's his answer. We continue. A new marking appears. The diamond appears, and on the side of our Gemara, we have a topic heading that we didn't read, but let's read it now just for the sake of review. The Nosei, which we call Hemshech, this is a continuation of the topic we have begun already. We've written Lefi Rav Chisda Makdimin Elo ve'Eloam Haksuvim b'Pasuk Chav Daled. Makdimin is to change the order, to make something earlier. We make earlier the events of Pasuk Chav Daled, involving the processing of Elo ve'Eloam, the 2 ram offerings. Make them earlier, lohitzos kafel machta dechtiv v'Pasuk Chav Gimel, earlier than the events of Pasuk Chav Gimel. Chav Gimel involving the removal of the kafel machta from the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Ubekach motzim chamesh tefillos v'asor kiddushin, and with that we can now account for the 5 mikveh immersions and the 10 kiddushin. Under the Mivneh heading, you notice we have a diamond featured and a double underline which appear in the Gemara. The word maskif we have in a diamond here and a little bit later. Hatzois chilufios, the double underline introduces an alternative suggestion. Hatzos chilufios, limtzo, in this case we should say in the singular, hatzo chilufis, an alternative suggestion. Limtzo chamesh tvilos ve'asor kiddushin b'li l'shabesh haseder hamikros. Instead of altering the order of the psukim, saying that Chav Daled comes before Chav Gimel, keep everything the same, keep the order as it is, and we're going to now suggest an alternative so as to maintain the order of the psukim as they are. Al yedei kach shenafsik bein avodas hayoim loitzos kafel machta yedei avoda acheres b'soyer hanaseh b'chutz. There's another korban that appears in the Torah, but not in the Yom Kippur context, but rather in Bamidbar, Parshas Pinchas, Bamidbar, Perek Chof Tes. And there is a parsha dealing with the holidays, specifically Yom Kippur in our case, and the Torah features the Korban Musaf, and amongst the different animals that are offered, there is a Soyer Lechatas, whereas all the other Musaf sacrifices happen to be Oila Korbanos. We discussed this at some length in our previous year. The Soyer Hanase Bechutz was a Chatas offering, and our suggestion is, why not, after Pasuk Chof Gimel, or let us say after Pasuk Chof Beis, he had been dressed in the white clothing for the bulk of the Yom Kippur service. After Pasuk Chof Beis, he puts on the golden clothing in order to do the Soyer Hanase B'chutz, that which is taught in Sefer Bamidbar. And after that, for the Soyer Hanase B'chutz, the Soyer, the sin offering, it's a goat that's done in the Azorah. That's why it's called B'chutz. It's done in the Azorah. Its blood is sprinkled on the external courtyard Mizbeach. For that he needed to change into the golden clothing. And then after that, he goes to Pasuk Chof Gimel, puts on the white clothing for the entrance to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, for the removal of the Kafum Achta, and that would be his fourth Tvila, and then the change back into the golden clothing for Pasuk Chof Daled, for the Eilo V'Eil Ha'am. Notice we preserved the order Chof Beis, then we inserted something external, then Pasuk Chof Gimel, and then Pasuk Chof Daled. And with all of that, we have also accounted for the changes of clothing and the required mikveh immersions, getting us to a total of 5. We turn now to the Gemara, the diamond. Maskif lo Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera asks on Rav Chisda's, on this approach, basically taken by Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda was explaining why we had to put Chof Gimel before Chof Daled, why we had to put Chof Daled before Chof Gimel. Rabbi Zera says, V'dilma mafsik le b'soyer hanase b'chutz. Instead of putting Chof Daled of Eilo V'Eil Ha'am before the Hotzas Kaf U'Machta, keep things as they are, and mafsik means interrupt the flow, as opposed to changing the order, simply interrupt the flow. By after Pasuk Chof Beis, I insert the Soyer Hanase B'chutz, which isn't written over here. It's found in Sefer Bamidbar, Perek Chof Tes. And by doing that, we don't have to change the order. We don't have to change the order of the Psukim in Vayikra Perek Tezayin. Omar Abaye, Omar Kro. Abaye says that we're not going to do that, but Chof Daled has to be before Chof Gimel because the pasuk itself begs that. It says in the pasuk, "V'yotza v'osa es oilosai," and that was it. That's pasuk Chof Daled. Miyitzia Rishona Ovid Eloi V'Eil Ha'am. From his initial exit, he is doing the Eilo V'Eil Ha'am. Now, what do we mean by his initial exit? Well, look in Rashi. Omar Kro V'Yotza V'Yosa V'Zuv Yitzia Rishona Amora B'Parsha. This is the first exit stated in the Parsha. We say the exit. It means the exit from the Heichal. There is a first exit from the Heichal. He's doing this. Hilkoch al korchoch mekamitzes kafu machta ovid lehu. Therefore, it has to be taking place before the removal of the kafu machta. Behafsoka shebeinehem la'avodas hayom. In the gap, or the interruption, or the break that takes place between them, between the Hoitzos HaKaf U'Machta and the Avodas Hayom. In other words, he did the Avodas Hayom. after doing the Avodas Hayom, which involved the incense, and he had left the Kodesh HaKadoshim already. The incense was done quite a bit earlier. He had left the Kodesh HaKadoshim for all kinds of other things. At that point, that he had, as we said, he had already left the Kodesh HaKadoshim, included in that departure was the Elo V'el Ha'om. So that the Elo V'el Ha'om had to be before the Hoitzos Kaf U'Machta. It was something done earlier in the day. So even though it appears after Hoitzos Kaf U'Machta, the Pasuk forces us to say that the Elo V'el Ha'om had to have been done earlier. We continue in the Gemara. Rava Omar. Now here Rashi provides the structure based on whom we've put a crown marking around Rava, so that Rava is not a comment on that which was just said. Rava is not a response to Rabbi Zera's question, but rather Rava is a throwback to explaining why the Tanaic source told us earlier that the order of the psukim is not maintained when you get to Chof Gimel and Chof Dalet. So Rava Omar, and there is a Rashi that Rashi Dibur HaMaskil says Asher Lovash Kvar. That Rashi is going to be used to explain what we're going to see now in the Gemara. So in the Gemara we read, Rava Omar Kra. The Pasuk says, in Pasuk Chof Gimel, it says, Ufoshat es bigdei habad. And he removes the linen clothing, and that removal is stated after the Hoitzos Kaf U'Machta, because it had said in that same pasuk, it said, he entered the Amud, and we explained in the Tanaic source before, he entered it. What did he enter it for? He entered it for the removal of the Kaf U'Machta. And then after that it says he removes his clothing. That in and of itself is quite innocent, quite simple. However, the pasuk goes on to say he removes his clothing that he had been wearing. She'ein Talmud loymar asher lovash. You don't have to say in phrasing removal of clothing, and he removes the clothing that he had worn. Klum odom poishet elo ma shalovesh. Does a person? Is it not so that a person removes only that which he had been wearing? Elo ma Talmud loymar asher lovash. Why does the pasuk say those words? Namely, he removes the clothing asher lovash that he had been wearing. So the answer to that is he removes the clothing. Asher lovash means shelovash kvar, meaning this is the second removal of linen clothing. So how do you account for that? How do you account for this being the second removal of linen clothing? If you keep the order of the psukim as they are, in other words, you were reading psukim Chof Aleph, Chof Beis, all of those psukim had him wearing the white clothing for the first time. That was part of the first order of events during which he was wearing white clothing. In Pasuk Chof Gimel, we said there's the added expression of Asher Lavash, means he is removing the white clothing that for the second time. So where was the first removal of white clothing? The answer to that is the first removal of white clothing had to have taken place immediately after Pasuk Chof Beis. So then what was he doing at that point? He would have been wearing something, he would have been put on his golden clothing, the big days of. To do what? Well, to do that which it says in Pasuk Chof Daled, the Elo v'El Ha'am. And then after that, he put back on the white clothing for Hoitzos Kafu Machta, and then removed them for the second removal. That's what the pasuk says. Asher Lavash. This is the second time he had worn them and now is removing white clothing. So the Torah itself is forcing us into this position of saying that the events in pasuk Chof Daled took place before the events in pasuk Chof Gimel. And that's Rava. Notice the difference between Rava and Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda's approach was based on halacha l'moshe misina, based on accommodating an oral tradition. Rava's approach is from the scripture itself. The same question is asked in the Gemara as we asked before. Maskif lo Rabbo bar Rav Shilo. In this case, as opposed to Rabbi Zeir asking the question, Rabbo asks this question. Why not preserve the order of the psukim as they are, and after pasuk Chof Beis you insert this korban, this sacrifice from we imported from Bamidbar, which would make him change into the golden clothing. Finishing this, Soranasa B'chutz, he would then change back for the second wearing of white clothing for Hotzos Kafu Machta, remove that from the Kodesh, remove them from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, then switch back into the golden clothing for Pasuk Chof Daled. Why not do that? Why not say this approach? The Gemara answers Hoksiv, but we have to confront that which it says in the Pasuk. Now, this is what Abaye had said before, V'yotza v'osa. And V'yotza v'osa means that the Elo v'El Ha'am that is featured in Pasuk Chof Daled had to have been processed during the first wearing of the white clothing. As Abaye said before, Miyatzir Rishona Ovid Elo v'El Ha'am, from the initial departure from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he had already done the Elo v'El Ha'am. So it couldn't be taking place right now. The Gemara continues, questioning that which was mentioned at the top line. We have a little arrow helping you to associate the Gemara now with what we saw earlier. And the question lasts a number of lines. V'chol parsha kulo nemra al seder. Is that really so that the entire parsha is in order, with the exception of Chof Gimel and Chof Daled? V'hakroi ksivi. When you look at the pasuk Chof Hey, it says v'es chelev hachatos yaktir hamizbecha. V'hoder, and then in pasuk Chof Zayin, it says v'espar hachatos v'soir hachatos. Pasuk Chof Hey describes the innards of the Yom Kippur sacrifices. The chelev hachatos, the innards of the par v'soir of Yom Kippur, are offered on the Mizbeach. Later, in Pasuk Chof Zayin, it talks about the burning of the carcasses of those animals outside of Shalosh Machnos. Ve'ilu anantanan, and we've learned in the Mishnah already, Haroya es kain hagadol kishukoirei eino roya par v'soir hanisrofim. One who is present during the Kohen Gadol's reading of the Parsha would not be able to be present at the burning site of the Par V'Soir of Yom Kippur. In other words, the events in Pasuk Chof Zayin are taking place at the same time that the Kohen Gadol is reading the Parsha. Let us add that the Kohen Gadol is the burning of those carcasses is taking place at a time that the Kohen Gadol is still wearing his white clothing. V'ilu emurei chatos the events of Pasuk Chav Hey, Bosar Hachi Maktir Lahu. They were offered at his third immersion when he was doing the Eilo V'el Ha'am. So that very simply, the events of Pasuk Chav Zayin had to be taking place before the event featured in Pasuk Chav Hey. So, not just that Chav Dalet is before Chav Gimel, but Chav Zayin has to be before Chav Hey. The Gemara says you're right. And the comment made earlier at the top of the Amid that said the whole Parsha is in order, it doesn't mean literally the whole Parsha is in order except for Chav Gimel Chav Dalet. Ema chutz mi Pasuk ze v'elech. What we meant earlier was that the whole Parsha is following the order of events till you get to Pasuk Chav Gimel. At the point you get to Pasuk Chav Gimel, the continuation of the psukim do not reflect order of events. Question: Umay chozes de meshabshis kroi shabish masnisa. What is it that motivates us to meshabshis is to ruin the order of the psukim, to say that the events of Chav Zayin took place before the events of Chav Hey? Shabish masnisa, change the order of events as reflected in the Tanaic sources, and simply say that the Sreifas Apar V'Soyer, the burning of those carcasses, that took place after the third immersion. In other words, the Mishnah said before that one who sees the Kohen Gadol reading the Parsha, he can't see the burning of the carcasses. Well, change that information and leave the psukim as they are. Events of Chav Hey, which speaks about the burning of the innards, precedes the burning of the carcasses reflected in Pasuk Chav Zayin. Omar Abaye, Omar Kra. The grammar of the psukim indicates otherwise. You find in the psukim words in Pasuk Chav Zayin, you see V'hamishaleach. In Pasuk Chav Ches, you see V'hasoyreif. Those words, as we say, appear in the psukim as they are. In Pasuk Chav Zayin, Perik Tezayin, Pasuk Chav Zayin. Actually, just one minor correction. In Pasuk Chav Vov, the word Hamishaleach appeared. That's in Pasuk Chav Vov, and in Pasuk Chav Ches, as we said, the word V'hasoreif appeared. Pasuk Chav Vov was making reference to the sending away of the Soyer L'Azazel, and it said there, "V'hamashalech es haSoyer L'Azazel yichabes begod v'rochas es besor b'mayim," that the one who sent away the Soyer L'Azazel, he absorbed clothing impurity. He has to yichabes begod, he has to immerse his clothing because they became tomei. And it says in Pasuk Chav Ches, "V'hasoreif oisam yichabes begod," that's a reference to the one who was burning the carcasses of the Par V'Sor Yom Kippur. He also experiences this clothing tumah. The Gemara continues, Ma Mishaleach de Meikora, just like Mishaleach is something that took place in Pasuk Chav Beis. In Pasuk Chav Beis, the Torah describes the sending away of the Soyer L'Azazel. So the Tumah took place though it's reported in Pasuk Chav Vov, nevertheless the Tumah took place back in Chav Beis. So to Af Soyreif, so too that which is featured in Pasuk Chof Zayin, or more in Pasuk Chof Ches, it said V'hasoref, so too that Demei Ikora, so too that had to have been taken place earlier. We mentioned V'hasoref, but the actual burning that we're describing was in Pasuk Chof Zayin. So just like the grammar of these words, V'ha-mishaleach took place earlier, so too V'ha-soref, the events of Pasuk Chof Zayin and Chof Ches had to have taken place earlier. That's Demei Korah, and hence it's quite likely that it was before the events of Pasuk Chof Hey. So, as a result of this, we have to say that the psukim are out of order. In other words, the events in the psukim are not in the order that the psukim appear. The Gemara says, Adarabba, to the contrary. Ma soref dahashta, just like soref, it could be right now. In other words, the events of Chof Zayin are where they are. Af mishaleach dahashta, so too the sending away is right now, and that would then mean that the sending away is after the haktoras emurim, and that so that this way we're saying keep the psukim as they are. The Gemara says no. V'ha-mishaleach demeikora mashma. Grammatically, the word v'ha-mishaleach indicates something that had taken place earlier, so that the tumah that's reported in Pasuk Chof is tumah that had taken place earlier at the events described in Pasuk Chof Beis. So the psukim themselves, as we said, are forcing me into a position to say that they are out of order. Rava Omar, a second approach. We have an indication to look into the Rashi. Rashi is found in the wide lines, fourth wide line under the Gemara text. Rava Omar, Lo motzis amris de shiluach soyer lo b'mekomo nemar. You can't say, like was suggested in the Adarabah, just above this, you can't say that the shiluach soyer is not in its place. In other words, there was an attempt to say that to keep Pasuk Chof Vav and say that at that point the sawyer was sent away, you can't say that. Why not? The Torah never expects the sawyer lazazel to remain so long, to stick around so long. It was definitely sent away earlier. So the Gemara, we read this now in the Gemara. Rav Omar Kro Yo'omod Chai. That's the pasuk that is relevant to the Soyer HaMishtalech. Has to be pasuk Yud. Ad Mosai Yezokuk Lamud Chai. To what point did it have to be standing and remain alive in the Beis HaMikdash? Ad Shas Kapora, until the point of atonement. The Amos Shas Kapora, at what point is the atonement? B'shas Matan Domim V'su Loi, at the point of the blood applications, what we call the Avodas Hayomi, till that point and not any longer, and not till the point of Haktoras Emurim, which is something that takes place later on. So with Rava's comment, we see that the suggestion of the shiluach taking place that late in the day is not a suggestion, and that's because of the other pasuk which said Yo'amad Chai, which means it stays around only till Shas Kapora, which is much earlier. Hence, the sending away and whatever information you see in Pasuk Vav had to have taken place earlier. So, once again, we see that the psukim are out of order. Parenthetically, just an editorial comment here, and it sounds maybe to some ears that this is very harsh. We're saying that the Torah is written out of order. Have no fear. The Torah Shebeksav is subsidiary to the rules dictated in the Torah Shebal Peh. So that in order to understand the Torah, the written law, it basically is a sealed book. It's not understandable without the oral tradition that accompanies it. So with that in mind, we appreciate that the Torah itself, as we said, remains as a type of sealed book. It's given as something that we're told ahead of time, you cannot understand this as it is. And there are many, many, many descriptions of that throughout the entire Chumash. In fact, anyone who is a student of Gemara knows how many times things appear in the Torah, in the raw psukim, that don't make any sense. No sense at all, whether it be from a grammatical standpoint or factual standpoint. They don't make sense unless you read the Chumash along with the Torah Shebal Peh. So that's what we are seeing over here. It shouldn't, at the end of the day, this shouldn't bother anybody that we're saying the psukim are out of order. The whole yesod of understanding the Chumash is dependent upon accepting the rules and teachings, the instructor's manual, so to speak, that the Torah Shebal Peh represents. We turn back to the Gemara, and before we learn the Gemara itself, we have a slash mark in the text indicating that which follows is a new discussion. On the side we have the Nosei, our topic heading, under which we've written Mifgash Im HaKohen Gadol Achrei Avodas Hayom. We're going to have the Mishaleach, the one who had accompanied we'll call the Ish Iti, the person who had accompanied the Sorel Azazel out to the cliff. He then, afterwards, we see him coming back and meeting with the Kohen Gadol. The Gemara. Osi Mishaleach, and this is the next day, Motzoi Yom Kippur. After all, the Mishaleach was we had learned earlier, he had been stuck out there, so to speak, in the Midbar. It was either a 10 meal or 12 meal journey, depending on the different Tanoim. Way beyond the Tchum Shabbos, he couldn't have come back to Yerushalayim. So the next day, though, he comes back. Osi Mishaleach, and the Mishaleach, the Ishiti, the appointed person, comes back and meets the Kohen Gadol. We have in our markings in the Gemara Aleph and the next line Beis, where might he meet the Kohen Gadol? So there are two scenarios. Motzo b'shuk the Kohen Gadol. If he meets the Kohen Gadol in public, shuk is a marketplace where there are a lot of people standing around, and we have an interest here in bestowing honor to the Kohen Gadol. He was the leading figure of the generation. So the Ish Iti, upon greeting him, says the following greeting: Omer lo, Ishi Kohen Gadol asinu shlichuscha. The address of respect to the Kohen Gadol, he says Ishi, it's an address of respect to the Kohen Gadol. We have done your mission. Meaning, I, carried out your instruction. Truth be told, it's the Kodesh Baruch Hu's instructions, but as a means of showing honor to the assembled, this is how the Mishaleach, the appointed person, addresses the Kohen Gadol. However, Motzo B'Bei, so if his initial encounter with him is in his house, in private, Omer Lo, so the Mishalech says to the Kohen Gadol, Mechayeh Chaim Asinu Shlichuso. Mechayeh Chaim is a reference to he who provides life, the Almighty who provides life. We have done his mission. Here, the actual truth is what is said, because here there's no agenda of ingratiating the Kohen Gadol in the eyes of others. Omar Rabba ki mifteri Rabbanon mehadodi b'pubadisa. When the scholars would depart from one another in Pubadisa, they had a practice. Amri Hachi. They would say as follows: Mechayeh Chaim yitein l'cho Chaim arukim v'toivim v'musukanim. May the Almighty, who is the source of life, give you a long and good, positive life. Since we mentioned Chaim, so we have a pasuk that we darshan. As halech lifnei Hashem ba'artzos hachaim. This is a pasuk that is in the Tehillim, and people might be familiar with this from the Hallel. Omar Rav Yehuda ze mokim shvokim. David HaMelech is saying, I walk in the land of the living. What is the land of the living? So Rav Yehuda says that's a reference to marketplaces. Rashi, 3 lines from the bottom, ze mokim shvokim she'odem moitzi liknos mizaynosov. In the markets, a person buys his food with which he is able to maintain his life. David HaMelech, who was always he was very often on the run. He was pursued over a significant part of his life. And a person who is in pursuit realizes, more so than a person who sits in the comfort of his home, he realizes the significance of having a place to get food. So he prayed, I should have the merit of walking in front of the Almighty in the markets. If you take things at this level, he's saying, I hope I find markets. And as Rashi explains, he was on the run, and for someone like that, this was all the more significant. The pasuk says, "Ki oirich yomim u'shnois chayim v'shalom yosifu loch." V'chi yesh shonim shel chayim v'yesh shonim she'enam shel chayim. Is there such a thing as years of life and years of non-life? Amar Rabbi Elazar, Elu shnoisav shel adam hamishapchis olav meira l'toiva. The reference to shnois chayim is like human experience, where a person might have experienced a period of ra, of bad, of negative, and all of a sudden it switches to good. Rashi says, a person who lived a life of poverty and in his old age he became wealthy, gives the person feeling that he's come to life now, only now. And in fact, there's a concept elsewhere that an oni choshev kameis, that a person who lives in poverty is like a person who is dead. So the shnois chaim is, in fact, during one's life, he can feel as if he is born anew with this type of change of events, from the ra'ah l'toiva. And that's what the shnois chaim is a reference to, that in the question of the Gemara, what is there, 2 kinds of life? Yes, there are. There's the standard physical, biological life, and then a second life where a person feels that he's gone from a situation of despair to a life of comfort. We continue with another drosha, Alechem Ishim Ekra. We're going to see a series of comments we have featured with triangles, Sidra, and on the side under the Mivneh heading, Sidra Shel Meimros of Brachya. Now, this pasuk is coming from Sefer Mishlei. Rashi claims that this pasuk is connected by virtue of its presence in Sefer Mishlei with the drasha we were just learning. However, some Meforshim question what Rashi is saying because the gap between them is so great. We were dealing with Perek Gimel and now Perek Ches, so leaving some room to understand why is this drasha over here. But if you take things as Rashi says, this drasha, this pasuk Alechem Mishim Ekra is connected in some way to Ki Orech Yomim Ushnois Chayim Shom Yosifu Lach that we had just before. So Omar Rav Brachya Elu Talmidei Chachomim Shedoimin Lenoshim V'Oisin Gvura Ke'anoshim. The pasuk of Alechem Ishim is taken, the word Ishim is taken to refer to a woman. It's a Halashon of Isha by virtue of the fact it doesn't say Alechem Anoshim Ekra. So what is being described here are Talmidei Chachamim that resemble women. In what sense? Rashi says, "An v'sonin u'tshushes koach." The natural characteristic of women is to be humble. There's greater humility amongst women than there are amongst men, and they are weaker. So that is a description of Talmidei Chachamim, who are, generally speaking, they are humble, and they are, as a result of their expending strength on Torah studies, that weakens them. We see elsewhere Chazal make reference to Torah mateshes kochos shel adam. The study of Torah weakens a person, and you can see an illustration of this in the 7th parak of Bava Metzia with Reish Lakish and his story with his encounter with Reb Yochanan. So the pasuk says, Rav Brachya says, the Alechem Ishim Ekra is a reference to Talmidei Chachamim that resemble Noshim in the way we just described, resemble women in the way we just described. The Oisin Gvura Kanoshim, and they do acts of great strength like men. The Omar Rav Brachya. Rav Brachya has another drasha. In fact, it will be on the same pasuk. He says, "Haroitze lenasech yayin al gabi hamizbeach." If one wants to experience the fulfillment of nisuch hayayin, this is a practice of pouring wine over the altar in the Beis Hamikdash. Of course, if someone is not a Kohen, so there's no chance he'll ever be able to do actual nisuch hayayin. But let's say someone wants to have the merit of doing nisuch hayayin without the actual act in the Beis Hamikdash. Yamale groinam shel talmidei chachomim yayin. Let him benefit Torah scholars. Literally, it's let him fill the throats of talmidei chachomim with wine. The analogy on a literal level is on the top of the mizbeach, there were tubes that led down, carrying with it the wine poured into those tubes. The throat of a person is also a tube, and filling that with wine would have the same effect. And the Talmid Chacham is associated with the act, or with the Beis Hamikdash. And where does Reb Brachya see this? Shenemar Alechem Ishim Ekra. Now, the pasuk, as we indicated before, is a reference to Talmidei Chachamim, but the word Ishim also has a sacrificial connotation. The pasuk says, Korban Isheh Lashem. Isheh, whose root is the word Eish, fire, so Isheh has, as we said, a sacrificial connotation. Sacrifice is something that is usually placed in the fire, but the wine offering is also a form of sacrifice, even though it doesn't go into the fire per se. Nevertheless, it's a form of sacrifice, as the word Isheh, and in this case Ishim, implies. And as we said a moment ago, the pasuk is a double reference to Talmidei Chachamim as well as to sacrifices, and if one wants to have the experience of offering a sacrifice, so bestow benefit upon a Talmid Chacham. Continuing in the Gemara, V'yomar of Brachya, Im roya odom sheter posek es mizaro, if a person sees that Torah is not continuing amongst his children, Yisa Bas Talmid Chacham. He ought to marry the daughter of a Torah sage. Shenemar im Yazkin Boretz Shorshoy Ubafer Yomuz Gizoy Mereach Mayim Yafriach V'Oser Kotze Kemoinata. The pasuk, without engaging in the literal translation, but if one sees that he is getting old and his roots are drying out and he's not producing anymore, so he should, as we said, he should marry the daughter of a Talmid Chacham and start to produce anew a generation, descendants that are Talmidei Chachamim. So many times you find throughout the Shas the significance of raising a family that is based on Torah study, based on growth in Torah and fulfillment of mitzvahs. And when we speak about these topics, it's not to the exclusion of all other kinds of, let's say, financial pursuits and means of living. Whatever a person decides to do, or whatever his life's pursuit is, Torah study must be a part of it. And through that, we're also concerned with the extension of Torah study to the next generation, having children and students that continue in those ways. The Gemara continues. V'yom tov hoya oise lo yahavov. We mentioned in the Mishnah that the Kohen Gadol, upon his departure from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and successfully completing the Avodas Yom Kippurim, made a type of holiday. Tana Rabbanan. And here we have an incident involving a Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Ma'aseh b'Kohen Gadol achar sheyotze Beis HaMikdash. Was an incident involving Kohen Gadol after he left the Beis HaMikdash. V'avu ozli kuli amo basrei. And the community, all of the people around, followed him. He was the center of attention, the star attraction. Kevan dechazinu l'shmaya v'avtayin. When the people in that particular story noticed these sages, Shmaya v'avtayin were the Gedolei Hador of their generation. Time-wise, we're dealing with the latter part of the second Beis HaMikdash. Shmaya v'avtayin were the teachers of the famous Hillel and Shammai, and we know that they lived toward the end of the first base, the end of the second Beis HaMikdash. So when the community saw them, Shavkuhu l'didei, they left the Kohen Gadol, the Azli Bosri Shmai V'Avtayin, they went to follow the Gedolei Hador. L'sof Osri Shmai V'Avtayin l'fturi minei the Kohen Gadol. They were, as we say, great sages and also humble individuals, and it was their feeling that they should take leave of the Kohen Gadol. So when they came to request to take their leave from him, Omar Lahen, the Kohen Gadol, said to them, and you can imagine the Kohen Gadol was maybe insulted or miffed by the fact that the honor that he was experiencing had been abruptly interrupted by the Tzibur leaving him for the sake of honoring them, Shmaya v'Avtayin. So he says to them, Yesun b'nei amamin l'shlam. B'nei amamim is an expression referring to people whose origins are not from amongst the Jewish people who converted. So he says, let the converts, or the children of converts, go in peace. Omru lei. Now, speaking to a person, one is told from Maseches Bava Metzia, the end of the fourth parak of Bava Metzia, there's a concept known as Oinoas Dvorim. It's to cause a person pain through speech which could be insulting. If a person, let us say, had converted away from idolatry, that's a conscious choice to leave a lifestyle that is that is only one after one studies and discovers how wrong and mistaken a lifestyle of idolatry is, and then joins the ranks of the Jewish people, accepting Torah mitzvahs after the proper conversion, one doesn't want to be reminded of their past, and rubbing it into somebody, telling them, reminding them of their past ways, is insulting. Well, that's exactly what this Kohen Gadol did to them. Amru lei, so they responded as follows: Yesun b'nei amamin l'shlam da'avdin uvdo da'aroin. Let the descendants of converts. See, as far as Shmaya v'Avtayin is concerned, Rashi says on the third line from the top, calling them b'nei amamin is loshen genaihu. L'fi sheba'u mibnei bonav shel Sancheir. They were from the descendants of Sancheir. The Gemara says in Maseches Gittin that the descendants of Sancheir was the Assyrian emperor in the time of the first Beis Hamikdash. From amongst his descendants, there were people that converted, and Shmaya v'Avtayin were from them. So the Shmaya v'Avtayin, upon hearing their insult, they respond, so let the descendants of converts go in peace. The Avdin Uvdad Aaron, at least they practice the ways of Aaron. Aaron, as the Mishnah in Maseches Ovus tells us, was an Oyev Shalom and Roidev Shalom. He was a person that was in pursuit of peace, and so let us, the children of the descendants from idol worshippers, go in peace, that at least we follow the practices of Aaron. V'lo yesi bar Aaron l'shlam delo ovid uvda de Aaron, but not the actual descendant of Aaron. He shall not go in peace, for he does not follow the ways of his predecessor, of his ancestor. The Mishnah. Kohen Gadol mishamesh b'shmoina kelim v'hedyot ba'arba'ah. The Kohen Gadol wears 8 clothing, generally speaking, and the common Kohen wears 4. And what are the 4 of the common Kohen? B'ksoines u'michnosayim u'mitznefes v'avneit. The ksona is a type of, say, shirt or tunic type garment. Michnosayim are for the lower part of the body, pants. Mitznefes is a head covering, a type of hat. Avneit, a belt. Moisif alav Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol had an additional 4 articles of clothing: the choshen, ephod, umiil, v'tzitz. Be'elu nisholim be'urim v'tumim. Only when wearing all of these 8 articles of clothing would the Kohen Gadol be addressed while wearing the breastplate. The Urim v'Tumim were stones that were set into the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. V'ein nisholin elo lemelech. Now these stones would miraculously, upon having a question posed to the Kohen Gadol while wearing them, there would be a miraculous response where the letters written on or carved into the breastplate, into the stones of the breastplate, the letters would offer a response to the question. And only a king had the right to pose questions. We'll say pose questions to the breastplate, but everyone understands it was the Almighty's way of communicating the answer to the king. So v'ein nisholen elo lemelech ulebezdin, the king and to the court. Ulami shat sibur tzorach lo, or to someone who's necessary for the public. In simple terms, the breastplate was not there for private type questions. In the case of the king represented the tzibur, he represented the public as well as the court. Before we continue in the Gemara, on the side we have a topic heading, Mispar Hachutim Shel Pritim Shonim. The Gemara will be occupied for quite a while. In fact, this discussion carries over to the top, or to the first half of Daf Ayin Beis Amud Aleph. The number of threads that were used to make the strings that were used for weaving different articles of clothing or vessels in the cloth vessels in the Beis Hamikdash. So once again, we're dealing with strands that were used for threads or strings that were used for preparing different articles. But each thread was made of individual strands. They have a type of breakdown over here, and we're going to talk about different articles and the number of strands that were used to make the threads, or if you will, the number of threads that were used to make the strings used in preparing these different articles. Tonu Rabbanan, Dvorim Shinemar Bohen Sheish, where the word Sheish appears in the Torah in the context of preparing different garments, Kohen-related garments, Beis Hamikdash fabrics. So where you see fabrics referred to by the term Sheish, you should realize Chutan Kofel Shisha. Technically speaking, the word Sheish, and the Gemara will reveal this, has to do with linens. But there's much more to this very short word than just a literal translation of linen. The fact that it's called Sheish also has the number significant that the word conveys, 6. 6 strands to make the threads used for these kind of items. So there's 6 strands, 6 stranded threads. Moshzar, where you see Moshzar appearing in the Torah without Sheish, and that is the case in the preparation of the Rimonim. Rimonim were figurines that were attached to the Me'il of the Kohen Gadol, something the Torah calls Rimonim. Some like to translate the word Rimonim as pomegranate, so if you want to accept that translation, it would be a pomegranate-shaped decoration attached to the Kohen Gadol's garments. In that context, the Torah uses the word moshzar. Well, that tells us shmoina. How it does that, of course, the Gemara will have to reveal later. It means it was an 8-stranded thread. Me'il, the Me'il of the Kohen Gadol, Shneim also was 12 strands, and Poroises Esrim Va'arba'ah. The Parchos is the curtain that was found in the Beis Hamikdash, 24 stranded threads. Choshen, the ephod, Esrim V'shmona, the Choshen article and ephod of the Kohen Gadol, 28 stranded threads. As we go on in the Gemara, a double underline will appear, so kindly scan down the Yuma just to get a feel of the structure, noticing where these double underlines appear, and they continue to Daf Ayin Beis Amud Aleph. On the side, under our Mivneh heading, we've noted Tzitutim Mehabraisa. These represent quotes from the Tanaic source. The Chipus Moker L'chol Poret Shemuzker Sham, and we'll be seeking out the source for each one of the items mentioned. Chutan Kofel Shisha Minolan. We said in the Brisa that we just read that wherever you see the word Sheish, it's a reference to a 6-stranded thread. Where do you know that from? The Omar Kra. The Pasuk says, Vayasu es hakosnois Sheish, ves hamitznefes Sheish, ves parei hamigbos Sheish, ves mithnese abad Sheish moshzar. That's a Pasuk from Shmois, Perek Lametes, Psukim Chav Zayin and Chav Ches. Chamisha Kroi Ksivi. You notice the word Sheish appearing a number of times. The word Sheish, we said before, refers to linen. So that in these psukim, there are 5 references to linen. The word bad is counted as one of them because bad is sheish. So there are 5 references to linen in this pasuk. Chad legufei, the kisna nehevu. One is for itself, that the articles described in these psukim shall be made of that material. Kisna is associated with flax, which is the raw material for making linen. So kisna refers to linen. V'chad shechutan kofel shisha. One of the psukim, one of the words, is to tell me that it has to be 6-stranded. As we said before, instead of the Torah using any other word that it could have used to refer to linen, it chose the word sheish, indicating that it is to be 6-stranded. V'chad shiu shizurim, that the 6 strands must be twisted into one thread. V'chad l'sh'ar begodim, shaloi nemar bohen sheish. The other extra word is to tell us regarding other clothing that the Torah doesn't use the word sheish in their context, that they shall be made of sheish. Now you might be wondering, what are those other clothing? So Rashi tells you, lekamen meforish my nihu. This will be explained later. We have a little star indicating ayin beis amid aleph. You can see this to the right-hand side of the Gemara text. If you don't have patience, you can always skip ahead to ayin beis amid aleph, and you can see that the Gemara deals with that later on. We continue in the Gemara here. V'chad le'akev, and one is to tell me that it's binding, that you don't have an option of using any other material, and that things must be done as they've been taught here. There must be linen, 6-stranded, and twisted together into one thread. My mashma the high sheish kisnahu. Where do you see in the word sheish a reference to linen? And kisna, we wrote above that the word pishtim. Pishtim is a Torah word, kisna being the Aramaic equivalent. So where do we see that the word sheish is pishtim? You know, when the Torah refers to shatnez, it says semer upishtim yachdov. Pishtim being linen. In the context of shatnez, wool and linen cannot be mixed when making an article of clothing. So where do you see in the word sheish that it means pishtim? It means linen. We'll see a couple of approaches, and the diamond is used to highlight that on the side under the nosei mivne heading. The diamond represents 2 hezberim minayin lanu sheish equals pishtim. So we now continue in the Gemara. Amar of Yosi bar Chanina, the Amar Kra. The pasuk says bad. We saw just before a mifna say bad, and we saw that in the pasuk quoted from Shmos Perek Lamed Tes. And together with that, you also saw it said mifna say bad sheish mashzar. So the fact that the word bad appears together with sheish, we learn that bad means something alone, like the word levad. But the shoresh of that apparently is a 2-letter word, beis daled, davar ha'olim min hakarka bad bad, that which grows from the ground in an individual form. Rashi, across from here, says, davar ha'olim min hakarka bad bad, hapishton v'kanvus ein lohem badim v'anofim ke'etzim. The flax plant, which is the basis of the linen material, it's something that doesn't branch out like trees. Ela olin. It has leaves on it, but that's it. It has a single stalk with leaves. And the pishton comes from the central tube of this plant. We continue in the Gemara. The Amo Amra. Why not say that bad means wool? Wool is basically strands of hair that come forth from the animal. The Gemara answers, Amra if tsuli mifsala. Wool splits. People speak about split ends of hair. Well, wool splits into two. It's not singular. Question, Kisna nami if tsuli mifsal. The flax plant it's fibrous, and if you were to take a hammer and smash it, you'll notice it splits into fibers also. So it also splits. The Gemara answers, Kisna agav lakuse mifsal. The kisna, the fibers appear only after impact. It's not something that happens on its own in a natural way. Therefore, the kisna, is more accurately described as bad as opposed to wool. Ravina Omar Mehocha. Ravina says if you want to know that sheish means linen, so take a look at this pasuk. Now he quotes a pasuk from Yecheskel, which describes the clothing of the kohanim. And it says Pare pishtim yu al rosham. Umichnase pishtim yu al mosnehem. So you could, in the Torah, it mentions Pare hamigbos sheish. We saw this in the pasuk quoted before from Shmois, Perek Lamed Tes. Pasuk Chotches, it said, Ves Pare hamigbos sheish. Now, if you don't know what sheish means, you look in this pasuk in Yecheskel, where the more common word pishtim is used, referring to the same article of clothing, pare pishtim. The Gemara continues, Omar le Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi asks Ravina, he says, Ha mekami dosi Yecheskel man omra. Before Yecheskel came along, Yecheskel was a prophet that lived in the latter part of the first Beis Hamikdash period. It's very nice for Yecheskel to tell us what it is, but up till that point in time, from the time the Chumash Shmos Perek Lamed Tes was revealed to the Jewish people, how could they have known what it is? Oletamech. So Ravino says back, and this answer is a long answer, so take note of that. Oletamech Hadiam Rav Chisda, that which Rav Chisda says. The following, that a Kohen who is uncircumcised, or is heretical in beliefs, is unfit for avodah. Until Yecheskel came along and told us that information, how would anyone have known that? It's not spoken out explicitly in the Torah. When you look at the psukim of the Torah, there's no reference to this information. And what does it say in Yecheskel? Kol ben nechor orel lev orel basu lo ve'el mikdoshi. Anyone who is an orel lev, who is a heretical, orel basur is uncircumcised, he cannot serve in the Beis Hamikdash. Well, ha makami da'asi Yecheskel, that information prior to Yecheskel's coming, man omra, who said it, and obviously it's not something that Yecheskel invented. We have a well-known rule that a Novi cannot come along and say something new, something that was previously unknown. Ella, Gemara, Gemiri law. The Os Yecheskel Asmecha Akra. There was an oral tradition that contained that information. It was known from the time the Torah was given, but that information was maintained orally. Yecheskel came along and wrote it in a pasuk. Hachanami, so too, with regard to sheish being pishtim, Gemara, Gemiri law, it was known orally that sheish meant linen. Yecheskel came along and put it into a pasuk. There are many, many things in the Torah and in Judaism that remain purely oral. For example, when we say purely oral by way of scriptures, they remain oral. Of course, now that even the oral law has been written down into the Talmud and Sifrei Halacha, etc., so everything, so to speak, is written down. But as far as scriptures are concerned, there are many things that aren't found in the scriptures whatsoever. Example would be that your tefillin are black. How do you know that the straps of tefillin have to be black? That's an oral tradition. How do you know that when slaughtering an animal, that the trachea and esophagus are to be severed. Without, as far as that information being explicit in the scriptures, you're not going to find that. So you are relying on the oral tradition. We make a point of this because there are, unfortunately, many out there in the big wide world that have a great deal of respect that they accord to the scriptures. When it comes to things of an oral tradition called the oral law, they have this tendency to disrespect it, denigrate it, say it's something that the rabbis made up, and all kinds of other denigrating remarks. Heaven forbid, far be that from the truth. These are oral traditions that were not made up by any human being, but rather transmitted to Moshe Rabbeinu at the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, and maintained in an oral form for many, many years. And eventually, say many, many years, it was never recorded, these things were never recorded in the scriptures, but when the oral law was written down in the form of the Mishnah and the Talmud, so now we can see it black on white. But as we said in our Shiur earlier today, when we discussed order of psukim seemingly out of order, all of this boils down to the same root, and that is the Torah cannot be understood without the accompanying oral Torah Shebal Peh, the oral tradition that in fact is the basis, the heart and soul of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism. We continue in the Gemara. We have the next double underline, Moshzar Shmoina Minolan. We mentioned in the source above that where you see the word Moshzar in the Torah, it refers to an 8-stranded thread. Where do you know that from? Dichtiv. Now, we did point out earlier that this idea of Moshzar appearing without an accompanying Sheish expression, this is true when it comes to the Rimoinim, these decorations attached to the Kohen Gadol's garment. So the Pasuk says, Vayasu al shulei hami'il rimoine tcheles v'argoma v'soila shani moshzar. And there was made for the shulei, the bottom of the mi'il. The mi'il was a type of cloak that the Kohen Gadol wore. He wore that over his ksoines. There was made for rimoine. We mentioned these little decorations that were made of 3 different kinds of materials: tcheles, argomon, and toila shani. So you have 3 materials that were used in making the rimonim. V'yolif, and we have a house marking, and these are explained on the side as shlavim, the stages in the Gemara, lodas, to know, minayin, demoshzar is shmoina, is 8. So this is the first attempt. V'yolif moshzar mi paroches. And we do a gzera shava between the rimonim and the paroches. The paroches is a reference to Shmois Perek Chovav Pasuk Lamed Aleph. We have this on the side of the Gemara. We provide this pasuk, and we've written. Let's read the pasuk together. On the side, Shmois Chavav Pasuk Lamed Aleph by the Paroch says, V'yosisa Paroches Tcheles V'argomon V'soy Ashani V'sheish Moshzor Maaseh Choshev Yaseh Oisa Kruvim. The Paroches is made of 4 different kinds of materials: the Tcheles, Argomon, Toila Shani, and Sheish. Those are 4 things. And says Moshzor in this pasuk. Ma lahalon, just like over there by the Paroches, Esrim va'arba'a, there were 24 strands. Now, how do you get to 24 strands? So we must explain. First of all, in the Paroches you see the word sheish. And we said before that where you see the word sheish, you have to have 6 strands. Well, there's 6 strands, but there are also 4 materials. So you've got 4 times 6. That's a 24-stranded thread that was made that was present in the making, was used in the making of the paroches. So in the case of the paroches, 24 strands were present. Afkan, so too in the case of the rimonim, where you also have the word moshzar, esrim va'arba'ah. You've got to get to a total of 24. The moshzar, Gezerah Shava tells me 24 by the rimonim. Now the rimonim, if you look in the rimonim pasuk, you notice, we just quoted it in the Gemara text itself, there were 3 materials. So each one of these materials, in order to get from 3 materials and get to 24 strands, you have to say that each material was an 8-stranded string, or 8-stranded thread, and they were then combined, they were twisted together to form, in effect, a 24-stranded thread. And as the Gemara says, each one of the materials, each one of the 3 materials were 8-stranded. So that in the original source, we said moshzar means 8 strands. We learn it from the Gezerah, through the Gezerah Shava from Paroches, as we just calculated. The Gemara asks, V'neilef mechoshen v'ephod. Now there is a pasuk, Perek Chavches, pasuk Tesvav. We have it written on the side that deals with the choshen v'ephod. Also articles of clothing worn by the Kohen Gadol. And in that pasuk, if you read it together, let's read it together. It says on the side, we have it on the side of our Gemara. Asiso choshen mishpat maase choshev kemaase ephod ta'asenu zahav tcheles v'argama v'sashani v'sheish mosar ta'ase oisai. The choshen was 28 strands. Ma lahalon esrim mishmoina, and this will be discussed on Ayin Beis Amid Aleph as well. But for the time being, we're saying just like the choshen ephod were 28 strands, Afkan esrim mishmoina, say the same thing regarding the rimonim, so that you'll have the moshzar by the rimonim, just like the moshzar that you see in the pasuk regarding the choshen v'ephod, just like the choshen v'ephod was 28 stranded, so too the rimonim. And then as a result of that, then you're going to have to come up with a different definition for the word moshzar. It's not going to be 8-stranded, because we got to that 8-stranded by taking 24 and dividing it by 3. But now I've got not 24, I'm starting with 28. So the Gemara answers, Donin davar shelo nemar bo zahav. I'm going to learn the rimonim of the me'il, which is something where gold, zahav, gold, does not appear. Mi davar shelo nemar bo zahav, from the paroches, which likewise doesn't have gold in it. When we want to make a Gezerah Shava, we want to have the 2 elements of a like nature. So the me'il, the rimonim of the me'il, and the paroches have that in common. Both do not have a reference to gold. La fuke choshen v'ephod, to the exclusion of choshen v'ephod shenemar bohen zahav, where the Torah does account for gold. Adarabba, the Gemara says, if you want to use some type of logical means of deciding what to learn from what, so I'll tell you to the contrary. Donin beged mi beged lafuke paroches ti oyalhu. I would prefer to learn article of clothing, namely the rimoni me'il, which is the me'il is an article of clothing, from the ephod, which is also an article of clothing, to the exclusion of the paroches, which is a curtain. The oil is part of a structure. It's not an article of clothing. So the question comes full circle around. How do I know that moshzar means 8-stranded? Elodonin me avnate. I'm going to learn from the avnate. Now, in the case of the avnate, you will see we have the avnate pasuk on the side. Take a look at it. Shmois perek lamed tes pasuk chav tes. It says there, V'esel avneit sheish moshzor. Once again, you've got the moshzor word, and there are a number of materials. It says it's utcheles v'argomon es hashani ma'ase roikim kashit tzivos Hashem es Moshe. So you've got the avneit. There are 4 materials in the making of the avneit. There's sheish, there's tcheles, argomon, and hashani. And you've got the word moshzor in that pasuk, enabling me to connect it with the rimonim, vidonin, and through this comparison between the rimonim of the me'il and the avneit, notice how everything is in common. I have a beged. The avneit is an article of clothing as well as the me'il. The davar shelo ne'emar bo zahav, no gold is referred to. Mi beged from the avneit. It's an article of clothing. The davar shelo ne'emar bo zahav, and it also has no reference to gold. The ein donin davar she'ein bo zahav mi davar she'esh bo zahav, and I'm not going to learn the rimonim from the choshen v'ephod. Rav Mori Omar, Rav Mori is a second reason for not learning from the choshen v'ephod. Rav Mori Omar ta'asenu ksiv. The word ta'asenu appears by the choshen. Shmois perek chav ches posuk tezvav. We have that on the side. We have it in our Shas Ozer Gemara edition. You can see we underline the word ta'asenu on the side. The word ta'asenu appears, and that is a word of limitation or exclusion. Ta'asenu means make it. Ta'asenu lo zev lo la'acher. It is made like that with the 28 strands and not anything else. A third explanation of Rav Ashi in this case, Rav Ashi gives us a third explanation as why not to learn the rimonim of the meal from the choshen. In other words, not to learn 28. Why not learn 28 as regarding the rimonim of the meal? Omar Rav Ashi Omar the osisa ksiv. It says in the rimonim Shmois perek chav ches pasuk lamed gimel, and you can see we have this quoted on the side of the Gemara as well. And let's read the pasuk together. It says, "V'yasiso al shulav rimoinei tcheles v'argomon v'slashoni al shulav saviv v'pamanizov b'seicham saviv." Don't be confused, by the way, by the presence of the word zav before, because this is not a reference to the rimonim. It's a reference to a different decoration called the pa'amonim. But that aside, it says in this pasuk v'yasisa, by the rimonim. And what does v'yasisa tell us? V'yasisa ksiv, the Gemara says, 3 lines from the bottom, shiu kol asios shavois, that all of its makings shall be equal. Now, what do we mean all of its makings? There were 3 materials in the making of the rimonim. And the 3 materials must be equal when calculating the total number of strands. 3 different materials, and there's a total number of strands, and we should be able to divide that total number into 3 equal parts. If you're going to take 28 as your basis, if you were going to learn from the choshen v'ephod, you'd be using 28 as your basis. How are you going to divide that into 3 equal parts? Navid tlosa asora. Are you going to take the 3 materials in the rimonim and make 10 strands of each one? Then havuluhu talsin, and you're going to come to 30. You have 3 times 10, 3 materials, each material a 10-stranded thread. You get to 30, and we're supposedly learning from the ephod, but there was only 28 there. Navid trey de tisha v'chad asora. Maybe 2 of the materials should be 9-stranded threads, and 1 material 10 strands. So you have 18 plus 10. That would get you 28, but that doesn't conform to the Torah requirement. Omar krovi asisa shiu kol asiyos of shavos. The word asisa implies all the materials must be of equal number of strands, and that wouldn't be the case if you make two of the materials 9-stranded and the third material 10-stranded. So in the last section of Gemara till now, we've been dealing with how do you know that Mosh Zor, which appears by the Rimonim, means 8 strands. So we just explained that we learn from the Avnate, where you have the word Mosh Zor, and we know the Avnate was made of 24, total of 24 strands. The threads that were made to weave the Avnate were 24 strands. So too the Rimonim, which were made of 3 different materials, and a total of 24 strands, each material being 8-stranded. Hence, Mosh Zor, 8 strands. Me'il Shnei Mosar Minolan. What about the Me'il? Where do you know that it was 12? It was a 12-stranded thread. Dichtiv, the pasuk says V'asisa es Me'il ha'efoid. We're at the top of Ayin Beis Amud Aleph, Kolil Tcheles. Tcheles is a reference to wool, so it was one material. The word Tcheles, which appears in the context of the meal, is now the subject of a Gzeira Shava. V'yolif Tcheles mi poroiches. A Gzeira Shava between these two articles is made. Malahalon Shisha, Afkan Shisha, just like by the Poroches, there were 6-stranded threads. Each material was 6-stranded, so too in the case of the Me'il. Rashi at the top points out the word Kolil by the Me'il, Gedil. The word Kolil means Gedil. Gedil is something that's twisted together. You find that tzitzis is described in the Torah as Gedilim Ta'aseh Lecha, twisted strings. V'ein Gedil Pachos Mishnayim, Rashi says. Where you see the word Gedil, it means that whatever thread you're talking about, it's really a double thread. So that the Me'il was made of one material, was made of wool, and the Gzeira Shava connects this to the Poroches, and just like the Poroches was made of 6-stranded threads, it had several materials, but each material was a 6-stranded thread. In the case of the Me'il, whatever the thread is, it's got to be doubled because you see the word Kolil. So 2 times 6 gets you to a 12-stranded thread. Question: the Neilaf Mishulav V'Rimoinov, why not learn that the basic Me'il should be like the decorations attached to the bottom of the Me'il, the Rimoinim? Mala Alon Shmoinav Kan Shmoina. We said before that the Rimoinim, each material is an 8-stranded thread. And this we pointed out on Ayin Aleph Amud Beis. You have, of course, an arrow to the side to direct you back to where we said that. The Gemara answers, you know why I don't learn Me'il from the bottom of it, from the decorations attached to it? Donin Kli Mikli, the Ein Donin Kli Mitachshit Kli. We prefer to learn a vessel, the Me'il, vessel, an article of clothing, from another article, the Parochas, the curtain, and not learn the Me'il, the Kli, from a Tachshit Kli, from something that's merely decorative in nature. The Gemara says, Adarabba, to the contrary, I would say, Donin Gufo Mi Gufo, V'ein Donin Gufo Me Alma. It would seem more appropriate to learn the Me'il from something that is inherent to the Me'il, the Rimonim, which were attached to the Me'il, as a part of the Me'il. So to learn the unknown from the known, which is inherent, as opposed to learning the Me'il from something that's extraneous, the Poroches. The Gemara says, okay, well, you've got as far as logic is concerned, you've got a point there, that would have led me to think that the Me'il should be 8-stranded, 8, and then doubled would be 16 strands. So the Gemara says, Hainu D'Amrinon, that is what we meant earlier when we said that there was an extra word in the pasuk, the extra reference to Sheish, L'shar begodim shelo nemar bohen sheish. Other articles of clothing that don't have sheish written in them, nevertheless, the basic thread has to be 6-stranded. And in the case of meal, of course, we have the word kolio, which means you take your 6-stranded thread and double it, making a 12-stranded thread. So at this point then, we now know the source for the me'il being a 12-stranded thread. Continuing, poroches equals esrim v'arba. The poroches is 24. Well, dalid, there are 4 threads. The shisa, each one being 6 strands, lo dina v'lo daina, meaning there is no necessity in discussing this. It is so obvious. Of course, we mentioned all of this information earlier when we pointed out that where you see the word sheish, it means 6-stranded, and in the case of the poroches, there were 4 materials, hence the poroches is 6 times 4, 24 strands comprising the threads used for weaving the poroches. Choshen, the ephod, esrim ushmona min olam. We, of course, mentioned this in the course of our discussion on Daf Ayin Aleph Amid Beis, but where do you know that from? Where do you know that the Choshen ephod were 28 strands? Dichtiv, the Pasuk says, V'asisa Choshen mishpat masa choshev k'masa ephod ta'asenu zahav. And here we number the materials, Tcheles v'argomon u'soyashani v'sheish mashar. 4 basic materials, arba de shisa, 4 materials, each one 6-stranded, and we know that by the fact that you see the word sheish in this pasuk as well, as we pointed out earlier. So there's 4 times 6, that's 24, that equals esrim arba. Zahav arba, and 4 strands of gold thread as well. In your mind, you might say that there was 1 strand of gold attached to the each thread of different material. So there are 4 different materials. Each one of those 6 strands had 1 strand of gold attached to it. So you have your basic 24 plus 4 strands of gold. So there's a total of 28 strands in the threads comprising the Choshen v'ephod. Zahav, we read Zahav arba, ha, esrim, v'tanya. The Ema Zahav nami shisha. Why not say that the gold also is a 6-stranded thread? Omar Rav Acho Bar Yaakov, Omar Kra. The pasuk in the context of the ephod says the kitzeitz psilim. Psilim, the word psil in the plural, psilim, hare kan arba. The word psil itself is something that's doubled. So if you have doubling of double, you get to 4. And Rashi says, psilim mashma train, ukshikoitzis kol echod l'shnayim havalu arba. So Rashi explains differently than we said, so to be in a line with Rashi, of course, kitzeitz psilim, you cut the psilim. The psil is 2, and having been cut into 2, you get 4. Now, the pasuk is found on the side of the Gemara, just to see it in its context. Shmois Perek Lametes, pasuk Gimel. It says there, and that, by the way, this pasuk Gimel is coming on the heels of pasuk Beis. In pasuk Beis, it says Vayas es ha'ephod. We have this written on the side. I hope everyone is following. It says Vayas es ha'ephod zov tcheles v'argomel to'ashoni v'sheish mosar. Vayaraku es pachi hazov v'kitzeitz psilim la'asos b'soich ha'tcheles soich ha'argomel b'soich to'ashoni v'soich ha'sheish ma'aseh choshev. So from this, we understand that the gold is 4. There are 4 strands of gold that are added to the 24 strands comprising the material for the Halashon and ephod. Rav Ashi Omar Krov. Now Rav Ashi explains why we don't say 6. The pasuk says, to have it in these other materials, have it the gold. What am I to do with the gold? Navid arba'ah de tray. If I'm going to make 4 times 2, in other words, you'd have 4 threads of gold, each one having 2 strands. Havaluhu tamya. Then you'd come out with 8. And your suggestion before was there should be 6 like the other materials. So you wouldn't accomplish that by having double strand gold threads. Navid tray, make 2 threads of gold, each one having 2 strands. The tray, the chad, and another 2 threads of gold being made of a single strand, so that would get you to 6. Yeah, but that's also not good, because the osisa ksiv, the word the osisa appears in this context, Shiukol Asiyosef Shavos, from which we learn that all of its makings must be uniform, and if by making 2 of the gold threads 2-stranded and the other 2 single-stranded, you're lacking in this concept of Shavos, of equality, of equal, and that wouldn't help either. So you can't get to 6 by virtue of what it already says in the psukim. So we go back to the 4 as we understood earlier. 4 strands of gold are added to the 24 strands comprising the material for the Halashon and ephod, giving you a total of 28 stranded threads in their preparation. Before we conclude, let us remind you that if you wish to be in touch with us, we can be reached at gmarkings@gmail.com. With that, we conclude our Shiur for today.